Magandang umaga po. We're going to talk about measuring the impact of low carbon transport interventions on CO2 emissions. I'd like to thank the partners for this training again. It's thank you TRL, sorry, GIZ, Viola Transdev, IDDB, and UIDP. Just to give you an overview of what we are going to talk about. Una-una po tatanong natin, bakit ba natin kailangan i-measure itong CO2 impact ng mga transport intervention. So, kahapon po nakita natin yung implications ng transport, pumunta tayo sa financing. Ngayon, titingnan natin paano natin ito masusukat. We always say na what you can measure, you can manage. We'll also be talking about two general approaches to measuring CO2 emissions. Meron po tayong tinatawag na bottom-up and top-down approaches. And we'll talk about practical considerations. Sa road transport sector, napahirap. It's you know, you've got millions or even hundreds of thousands of agents, mga sasakyan, na kailangan mo i-considera para makakuha ka ng magandang numero. Okay, pakita ko lang sa'yo, what does it mean? What does it mean when you say that this is a ton of CO2? Ano ba yan? Ganito ba yan? Isang malaking bola. At ano ang ibig sabihin nitong 1 ton of CO2 sa atin? At mas importante, paano natin siya masusukat? Okay, what are the benefits of measuring CO2? The first one is gain an understanding of the impact of current policies and practices. When you are measuring CO2 emissions, effectively, you are measuring fuel consumption. Kung sa atin po, sa mga syudad natin, sino po dito mga taga-cities na, okay, ang dami natin, ano? Tanong ko sa inyo, pag sinabing, anong importance ng CO2 sa city nyo? Carbon dioxide. Meron ba kayong concrete na idea? Na direktang may, ano ba tawag doon? May pakonekta mo sa city? Wala masyado, di ba? Pero pag sinabi mo, anong kahalagahan sa inyo ng fuel consumption sa city nyo? Marami na kayo masasagot dyan. Importante yan sa kabuhayan, importante yan sa mahihirap, importante yan sa lahat ng bagay. Yeah. So, aside from that, indicate the impact of the proposed measure. Support the establishment of strong domestic policies that support energy efficiency and attainment of co-benefits. This is also related to that. When we are measuring CO2 emissions, we are measuring what we call also co-benefits. So not only CO2, but we're also measuring other impacts. So nandiyan na po yung, again, yung sa energy, sa fuel, and pwede mo ikamit dyan yung sa air pollution. And more importantly, as we have seen earlier, ito po yung increased access to international sources of financial support. As Co has already described this earlier, the different mechanisms now, the trend now for the different mechanisms, and also the existing ones, no, kunyari yung CDM, ganyan. Kailangan natin may ibibigay ka na numero. Ito yung aking nabawas. At tinitingnan din nila yung kalidad nung numbers na yun. So they're also looking at the quality of the numbers. It's not enough that you say that you're reducing this without any proof or any justification how you got the numbers. So it's very important in getting international climate finance for the different projects. Okay, Co mentioned this concept earlier, ito po yung measuring, verifying, and reporting. This is again very important if you want to move your transport projects towards the realm of climate financing, dun po sa carbon markets, saka dun sa iba pang climate financing instruments. We're looking at getting the estimates of CO2 mitigation, how much you are mitigating, how much you are reducing for your project or your activity. For example, if you're installing a BRT project, in a certain corridor, how much CO2, estimated CO2 emissions would you be reducing using that project? And you also need to look at the quantification of the impacts in terms of contributing to meeting the overall targets. So if it's not CO2 targets, also need to look at the other aspects ng sa projects po. And also MRV identifies the mitigation potential for each type of activity. So again, if you're doing multiple projects, if you have established certain measurement for your first project, you can use that if you are duplicating your projects in the future. And MRV requirement is very important in supporting transparency. Okay, just to give you some of the challenges on MRV in the transport sector, CO2 emissions, and transport sector project CO2 mitigation impacts. These are some of the challenges now. Number one, it's the unique nature of mobile sources of emissions in the transport sector. Again, you're dealing with a multitude of agents ng mga nagbubuga ng CO2. So, hindi katulad kunyari sa isang power plant, isa lang siya. Or sa isang grid, alam mo, ilan lang yung power plants dyan na nagbubuga ng CO2. Yung mga gumagamit kunyari ng coal, even yung nat gas, mga ganon. So, you can pinpoint sources. But in the road transport sector, makita niyo lang sa isang kalsada pa lang dami na, di ba? So yun yung isa sa mga pinaka mahirap na mga bagay tungkol dito sa pag-estimate na emissions sa sector na to. Patchy and insufficient data. I'll be explaining later on the process on how to calculate two general approaches to calculate the emissions from the transport sector. The problem mainly lies, for example, in developing countries that we don't have good data. We don't monitor, for example, the in-use vehicles. Yung pong, hindi yung registered kasi meron tayong registration data pero wala tayo, hindi ko lang sa Philippines ata walang deregistration data. So yung mga hindi na nagagamit, hindi na tinatanggal yan sa numbers para nag-accumulate na lang. Another thing, for example, the odometer readings. Hindi na monitor yun. And we don't have good databases for fuel efficiency of the different types of vehicles. If you decompose it further, for example, you don't have fuel efficiencies for different age of the vehicles, different types, different fuels, so mga ganyan. Pag dinecompose mo yan, dami na yan. No standardized baselines. I'll explain the concept of baseline later on. Pero yung ito po yung pag tiningnan natin yung in the future, if you look at what scenario would it be like if we don't do anything. So yung business as usual scenarios, walang standardized methodologies and standardized baselines sa ngayon, for example, in the Philippines. Complexity and costs of methods. And mamaya I'll explain it in the next slide, what I mean by this. When you're dealing with multiple agents, multiple vehicles, very complex system, the estimation of CO2 emissions, if you're going to be very stringent about it, you would need to conduct very detailed surveys, very detailed studies to be able to do this. And surveys, as we know, cost a lot of money. Another challenge is the availability of suitable modeling tools. Later on, I'll give you some examples of the current tools that are available that would vary in terms of the application, but in terms of the complexity, and in terms of the purpose why we should use this. And difficulty in estimating abatement costs, because you also have a difficulty in quantifying, firstly, the emissions reductions from the transport activity or transport projects. The quantification of the abatement cost, yung gaano po siya kamahal para makapagbawas ka ng isang tonelada, for example, ng CO2. Mahirap din i-compute yun dahil sa nature nga ng sector. And difficulties in ensuring endurance of emissions reductions. So, now I'll talk about some of the basic data requirements po para tingnan natin or masukat natin yung CO2 emissions from the transport sector and transport projects or interventions. Very basic po yung kailangan natin for estimating CO2 is the amount of fuel use. So ito yung mga basics. No? Kano kadaming fuel yung kinonsumo mo, ano yung ginamit mo sa pagkonsumo nung yung fuel, kung buses ba to, private cars, motorcycles, at yung kung gaano karaming carbon yung nandun sa loob ng 1 litro, for example, ng gasolina. Ito po yung sinasabi ko kanina. For example, ito yung project mo. Meron po tayong tinatawag na ex-ante estimation and ex-post. Pag sinabi lang po natin ex-ante, titingnan mo yung bukas. You have to project it. And ex-post, nandiyan na yung data, calculate mo na lang kung ano yung naging emissions mo. Later, we'll be looking in detail two measurement approaches, yung ginatawag natin top-down at bottom-up. Again, yung top-down will be starting with the national level data and we'll decompose it. So, kukunin natin yung national fuel statistics, for example, tapos bababa tayo, titingnan natin kung saan pumupunta yung fuel na yan, and doon natin i-allocate. In the bottom-up approach is the exact opposite naman. You look at your agents, how many vehicles are on the road, mga ganyan. So, titingnan mo yun sa ilalim, and you move upward towards the estimation of the fuel consumption and eventually the carbon emissions, carbon dioxide emissions. What are the, just a summary before we go to the details, comparisons, so the advantages and disadvantages of the bottom-up approach and the top-down approaches. So bottom-up, emission sources are assessed in detail based on data from individual sources. So again, magsisimula pa tayo dun sa mga sasakyan, for example. Tapos, titingnan natin yun, ano ba yung emissions nito. So mula ka sa ilalim, tataas ka. And it allows you to use information on local issues such as congestions and others. No? So makikita mo yung sitwasyon sa baba ng mas malinaw. Problema naman dito, the most accurate estimates require a large number of different data sets. So it's very complex because you're trying to address the emissions from the sources, from the individual sources. So it becomes a very comprehensive and complex exercise. And again, it requires an extensive amount of data collection and handling. On the other side, we have the top-down approach. So, nagsisimula po tayo sa national level data. So, normally this is available. Is there anyone from DOE? Wala po, ano? So, usually yung tinatawag nilang overall energy balance sheet, meron sila niyan for the national level. Tapos, naka-segregate na po doon. For example, fuel consumption, diesel, tapos by sector. So you can point to transport, road transport. So may total na po tayo dyan for national. The problem is when you do this in, for example, in the cities, I'm not sure if the cities would collect such a database. Disadvantages, although the data is relatively more available as compared to your data sources for the bottom-up approach, relatively lower level of detail. So what you would get aggregate numbers, so you have to break it down. And lack of data can make use of emissions inventories challenging. So again, it's a matter of input-output. If you don't have much or good input data, then once you make your emissions inventories, you would have multitude of questions regarding it, especially kung mag-assume kayo ng mga values kung wala kayong makitang values para doon, And it's not well suited for assessing the impact of transport policies. top-down approaches may be good enough, for example, if you're doing, a very rough estimate of total, for example, city transport CO2 emissions. But once you go into looking at transport policies and transport projects, you may find it difficult to look at the impacts of these because of the yung lack of detail ng ating data. Tingnan natin yung mamaya. Okay, ideally we should have a combined approach. For example, in the national inventory, you look at your bottom-up data sets, estimates, bottom-up estimates, and your top-down estimates. Unfortunately for the Philippines, we weren't able to do the bottom-up approach for the transport sector, mainly due to the lack of good data. Just to give you some of the data sources, so travel surveys and interviews. Usually in the bigger cities, you would have these studies involving, travel surveys and interviews. For the major roads, you would probably have your traffic counts, your public transport statistics, how many people are using the bus, the MRT. Metro Manila, meron po tayo niyan. Vehicle sales data, vehicle fuel sales data, vehicle speed detection units, fleet management databases, particularly if you're dealing with cities which would have lots of industries which monitor their fleet data. Importante sa kanila yan kasi kasama yan dun sa pag-assess nila ng costs nila. GPS data logs, so geographical positioning system. Nauuso na rin po ito ngayon sa mga, for example, yung mga cellphones. I'm not sure if the telecommunications companies are getting involved in this. Probably they have some projects on this, but this could be a very good source of data for travel activity. Kung saan po pumupunta yung mga tao, gano'ng kalayo, gano'n. And of course, census data. Probably this is the most common among these sources of data here. Okay, let me go through the details of the bottom-up approach. This equation for doing road transport CO2 emissions that you would encounter, it's called the ASIF, or as-if. I don't know how you pronounce it, but this is the most basic. You can actually apply this to other sectors as well, like electricity. Number one, yung A, total activity. Passenger or freight travel. Gaano kadaming, for example, yung tanong dyan, kunyari ako, how many trips do I make in a day? How many kilometers do I make? Number two, yung S natin, yung structure. Yung modal structure. Ito po yung tinatawag natin mode share din. Or anong mode yung ginagamit mo? What mode do you use in making the trip? Do you use a car? Do you use the bus? Do you walk? Do you take your bicycle and bike? So depende po, no? Ito yung pag-split natin, no? Total passenger or freight activity. Sa freight naman, pwedeng trucks, pwedeng rail, pwedeng through air, pwede rin sa water. So iba-ibang modes yan. So kailangan mong tingnan yan. Tapos yung I natin, this is the energy intensity. In simple terms, this is, for example, your kilometers per liter na nagagawa, for example, ng mga kotse nyo. So, sa 1 litro, gaano kayo kalayo makakatakbo. Ito yun. So, makikita natin sa bawat mode, iba-iba yan. Kunyari, bus, probably 3 kilometers per liter lang yan. Motorcycle, probably around 40 to 50, depende sa modelo. So, titingnan mo yan. Tapos, yung F, ito yung carbon content ng fuel. And from those asset factors, you'll get your G. I don't know why it's G, but it's carbon emissions from transport. Yeah, again, so it's merely a question of how many trips, these are just, example questions. Maraming different questions na pwede nating maitanong. How many trips do I make a day? How far is each trip for the structure? How will I make the trip? Will I take the bus, use a car? Intensity, how many kilometers can my car travel with 1 liter of fuel? Or the question of how full is the bus? How many people are inside the bus? And the fuel carbon content, how much carbon is in the fuel of the vehicle? So ito yung mga general questions na pwede natin itanong para makakuha tayo ng estimates on CO2 for the transport sector. Just to give you some of the data requirements for these 4 major components. For the activity, we can attack it again like a top-down. Fuel use data, annual vehicle kilometer traveled by detailed vehicle class. Meron lang sana tayo yung magandang database ng odometer readings from our emissions testing center. If they collect that, I think they don't collect it anymore in the Philippines. Possible data sources like surveys, vehicle registration licensing data, existing fuel use and kilometers per liter or fuel efficiency data sets, and data from train operators. Modal structure, you look at your composition of vehicle fleets. So ano yung breakdown niyan? Kunwari sa mga kotse, ilan dyan yung diesel, ilan yung gasoline, tapos yan, kung meron pa kayo mas detailed data, ilan yung ganitong taon, mga 20-year-old or 15-year-old. So it gets more complicated if you have those sorts of data. It gets more accurate. Modal intensity, kilometers traveled per ton of fuel used by detailed vehicle class or locomotive type. So again, kilometers traveled per ton. So minultiply mo na yung kinakarga niya, tsaka yung kinonsumo niya, tsaka yung dinala niya. Carbon content of fuel. So yeah, we have international, inventories and guidelines from for example, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Okay, so sources like those. This one, if you just note it, if you can Google it later on, this is one of the, they are sets of tools that we have developed CAI-Asia together with our partners. It's just ADB, IDDB, Jeff. Transport emissions evaluation model for projects. What we wanted to do here was to simplify the process of getting a rough estimate for a certain type of transport project. So meron po tayo dyan mga tools, for example, for estimation of emissions reduction potential for a BRT project, MRT project, improving walkability, improving the biking environment. So things like these, you can Google it, you can download this as a free set of tools. This one, just to give you an idea of the flow of this one is more of a bottom-up approach. Just to give you an idea of the type of indicators that we are looking at in the calculation of the CO2 emissions. So aside from yung mga these are some of the existing models. Again, this list is not it's not even a fraction of the total available models out there, but gives you an idea of what scale the models can be applied to, what are the data requirements, collection methods. Okay, just to give you an insight, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So again, when we're using models, it's always a question of what you put in it and what comes out. But it's more importantly, it's what you are using the model for. And far better an estimate answer to the right question than an exact answer to the wrong question. Again, balikan natin bakit natin ginagawa to. Why we are estimating the CO2 emissions or CO2 impacts of certain transport projects and the transport sector in general. So madami tayong models dyan, pero tanong natin palagi ano yung tamang tanong yung ginagawa natin. Setting the baseline, mga konsepto lang po ito na kailangan nyo tandaan. It refers to the scenario representing the GHG emissions that would occur in the absence of a proposed activity or project. In setting the baseline, you need to establish the vehicle fleet, identify the vehicle usage, gano'ng kadaming kilometrahe yung tinatakbo niya sa isang taon, the carbon content of the fuel used, and you look at your emissions. So it's an application of the ASIF equation. So if you're estimating projected emissions, you can look at historic emissions estimates and try to decompose the estimates using the ASIF elements, and combine each element of the ASIF equation with the data set that includes data for historic years and estimated data. The top-down approaches to measuring CO2 emissions, again, we've stated it earlier, coming down from the top, from the aggregate data, you're looking at data from the national ministries, for example, the annual fuel consumption for the transport sector. Then, if the overall energy balance sheets also have the per subsector, so road subsector, rail subsector, and the fuel consumption broken down by type of fuel and carbon content. So just to give you some examples, for example, private cars and motorcycles na gasolina. Number one, national petrol consumption is not often used for purposes other than for passenger vehicles. Itong mga ganitong pagkakataon, yung data natin, kumbaga pwede na para makakuha tayo ng magagandang estimates based on for example, if you look at the taxes, if you have those data to back calculate the fuel consumption on an aggregate level. You need to estimate the total number of petrol-operated passenger cars. You get it, for example, in your registration data, historic national fleet data sets, and combine these two data sets to be able to get a good estimate. You may also want to consider looking at the weight of the total, the composition of the vehicle fleet, so it's basically a combination of the fuel consumption per vehicle type, again, and looking at the activity of the different vehicles to come up with the CO2 emissions. Okay, just give a small or a brief review of what we have been talking about. This one is top-down, this one is bottom-up. Somewhere in between is the ideal, or combination of these two would be the ideal estimations methodology for looking at CO2 emissions from the transport sector. Okay, practical considerations for measuring CO2 impacts of transport interventions. You can remember these few key requirements in measuring CO2 emissions. Particularly for the inventory, you need to detail the tasks, the responsibilities, activities, deadlines relating to emissions estimates. If you're doing an inventory for a city, if you're working for a local government unit that is trying to look at the emissions from transport in your city, you would need to get the involvement of several key stakeholders. Hindi lang po kayo, hindi lang yung office nyo. Number one, you need the data, and you need some help, particularly in looking at the calculations. Probably you would need the help of the local offices handling the data, and if you could also involve the academe who would have knowledge on emissions estimation, mas maganda po yun kung masasama niyo sila dun sa exercise. Looking at the institutional arrangements, you need to look at the different stakeholders, identify their roles, what would be the agreements between you and the different stakeholders, Um, Very important po ito. Ito yung mga, hindi natin ginawa kanina mga practical implications itong mga to. Also, don't forget to do a quality framework. When you're doing your emissions estimations, you need to be transparent, consistent, comparable, complete, accurate. In cases that you cannot achieve, full accuracy, you need to do some assumptions. Ang palagi po naming recommendation dyan, if you're using assumptions, it's okay as long as you know where you got the assumptions from, and as long as you know the limitations of your calculations. So, very important po, we have to be transparent, we have to be consistent in the calculations. Again, kukonekta natin to dun sa mas malaking goal natin, kung bakit natin ginagawa yung inventory. Key challenges, number one, setting the geographical boundaries. Earlier on, we were discussing, for example, if you take the fuel sales from the gas stations inside the city. Well, the main consideration or a question there probably that would pop in your head is, would all the fuel that was bought burn inside the city, or marami dyan sa labas na? Yung mga ganyan, yung mga ganyan consideration. So, hindi ibig sabihin na binili mo dito yung fuel sa Quezon City, dito mo rin ginamit. Earlier, we also discussed a few points on leakage, or aside from yung mga hindi natin nakukuha na impacts. For example, naggawa kayo ng mga measures to improve yung traffic dun sa inyong lugar. Sabihin nyo, makakaganda to sa fuel consumption kasi bumibilis yung takbo ng mga sasakyan. Pero hindi natin alam, kunyari naglagay tayo ng highway dyan. Maganda nga yung takbo natin, pero yung highway, nagkaroon siya ng negative impacts. Mas maraming tao ngayon ang naiengganyo na mag-kotse. Kasi maganda na yung dadaanan. So, those types of interventions, we would need to look at the leakage, yung negative impacts. Yung tinatawag natin induced impacts, for example, travel. And difficult to obtain reliable data when it comes to looking at the leakages. And also, one of the key challenges, time scales of the impacts. Yung sinabi ko kanina, that the reductions that you are making now may be different from the reductions you're making tomorrow or the year after, 5 years. So the timing of the impacts is also difficult to predict. That's why earlier on we also look at the ex post and the ex ante. So constantly, if you have a project, you need to do the ex ante, and once you are going through the process of implementing it, you go through the ex post estimation of the emissions impact. Anyway, just to summarize the presentation, we look at the benefits of this. So there are many benefits to measuring the CO2 impact of low carbon transport interventions. Number two, there are a wide range of challenges that can be experienced when seeking to measure and estimate emissions, but there are also an increasing number of methodologies that can be replicated or adapted. So at this point in time, more and more people are looking at the transport sector, trying to strengthen the ways and trying to capacitate the different stakeholders in measuring the impacts of transport on or transport interventions on CO2 emissions, as people are starting to realize fully the importance of having a different or a menu of different methodologies that are available in tools which stakeholders or different people can use in order to look at the impacts of transport on CO2. The third one, the stringency of measurement requirements are variable. Okay, the most basic of data requirements are readily achievable in most circumstances. Data can be collected from a wide range of sources. So earlier on, we looked at different sources, different scales of data collection. Nandiyan na po yung mga surveys, technologically aided data collection processes, and national statistics. So you can have data to be able to start something out um, based on currently available data sets. No? There are numerous expert sources that can be consulted for advice. Specifically yung mga transport engineers, I think, for example, sa NCTS, if you're really looking at a network analysis, if you're doing a citywide analysis of the transport sector, depende rin po if you're looking at institution, kunyari sa organization ninyo, if you're looking at the GHG emissions from your travel there, it's also a different set of experts and tools and methodologies that can guide you to do that. Yung kagandahan, dumadami na yung mga taong may alam nito at mas mabilis yung pagproseso natin ng mga calculations. Okay, so just a brief overview again. The first thing we have to do, we have to acknowledge that there is a need to measure the CO2 impact of transport interventions due to different reasons, as we've covered. We need to understand the benefits of doing this. We need to be aware of the MRV process for measurement. Well, for example, under the UNFCCC. We need to recognize the challenges of measuring emissions from the sector due to the complexity and the nature of the sector itself. And we need to realize that we are not helpless, that there are current methodologies and tools that we can use to be able to look at the impacts of such of the sector and the different transport projects on CO2 impacts.